Welcome to Practical PLM Webinar Series Part 2, Creating a PLM Beachhead that drives 80% of the value with 20% of the effort. This webinar series is hosted by the VDR Group in partnership with ADRAS and PacificCAD. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Jamie Humphreys with the VDR Group. I'll be the moderator for today's session. Our presenter will be Martin van der Roest of the VDR Group. This is intended to be an interactive session. Please submit your comments and questions in the panel noted as questions. We will address them once we complete the presentation. This presentation is scheduled to be a crisp 25 minutes followed by 5 minutes of Q&A. If we don't get to your questions, we will respond via email. This session will be recorded. Within 48 business hours following this webinar, we will provide you with a link to the recorded session. You will be able to revisit the session as well as share with others. With that, let me pass it on to Martin.
Great. Jamie, thank you. And thank you all for joining. We're excited to be doing the second part in our Practical PLM series. And the previous webinar, we talked about what we entitled the promise of PLM and what it represented. And so what we want to talk about in today's webinar is the idea of how can we drive immediate value, what we might call the 80-20 rule, or the, in generalized terms, the Pareto principle of pursuing different activities. And so that's going to be the focus of our discussions today. Let me start by revisiting some previous concepts that we talked about in the first webinar. And we brought up this illustration of what's going on in an organization, the different activities from sales all the way through support and delivery. And we suggested that content is developed in each of these stages, requirements, proposals on the sales side, perhaps project management, schedules, resources on the project side, especially for build to order or engineer to order. There might be additional design work that's required, hence CAD drawings, additional bills, parts and bills, etc. And then that might move on to the ERP, the make stage of the activities, and that's where we have the item masters and additional information related to a lot of the transactional activities in manufacturing. And then we go into support, where we've got content that's created around potentially field documentation, replacement parts, etc. And so based on this, we then translated that to the idea of what we call this data cohesion and process repeatability quadrant, as you may remember. And we suggested that if we look at how organizations operate, we put up this idea of what we call the data cohesion axes. And on the left-hand side of this x-axis, we suggest that there's a disconnect of the various databases that exist in an organization all the way through this idea of the single source paradigm, or in PLM speak, what we've heard said is single source of truth. And then on the y-axis, we suggested that there's an importance of process repeatability. And so on the lower part of that, it's represented by what we might consider a lot of manual, verbal activities, things that rely on tribal knowledge, cultural habits, etc. And that then could be extended on the upper side of that to highly automated. So processes are repeatable, and an organization's assured of that. We said that this top right quadrant is what represents the ideal for an organization, for a manufacturing organization. That's what we called in the last session the promise of PLM. But the reality is many organizations that we work with that are exploring PLM tend to be in this quadrant. A number on the x-axis, a number of disconnected repositories and processes that frankly aren't very repeatable. Especially someone might have been in the organization for a while and then leaves the organization, and out goes that knowledge, that information about nuances of the processes that might have been into place. So the goal here is to move to this top right quadrant, and that's what we talked about in the last session, and we want to drill into that in this session. So the focus here is going to be on these strategies and the action plans that can get us there. I want to revisit what we talked about previously is another way to look at this. So when we talked about those axes previously, data cohesion axes, I'll bring this other slide back up, and we have those separate repositories. And the idea here is that those separate repositories really go away and are represented by this single source paradigm. So that's another way to consider this, right? So the organization and its different activities are able to access data in a single repository. Of course, what's this by us? What's this by you by doing this single source approach? Well, all the data, of course, as we can expect, and we talked about from sales all the way to delivery, behaves as if it's in one repository. People can go to that one virtual repository and be assured of getting the latest documentation, latest information that's accurate and current. And then we have the repeatable processes we just emphasized as a part of the operational value, and ultimately all of this drives improved collaboration and innovation. That's on the operational side. On the business side, why is this all important, and why does this have significant meaning? Well, from our standpoint, we like to correlate the activities of PLM to business value as it relates to the P&L. And literally, if you take a P&L top line, top portion of the P&L, you've got the revenues. So what does PLM do? What does this promise of PLM do? It drives proposal efficiencies from the sales side all the way through delivery. And we don't get into that here, but hopefully accurate and on-time deliveries. Then from a cost of goods standpoint, that being a line item in a P&L, you hopefully drive reduce scrap rework, minimize overstocking because the change process isn't effective, and folks are ordering product that has been changed and they're not aware of it, say, for example. And then, of course, on the bottom portion of the P&L, you've got the overhead expenses, and the idea here is to do more for less. So these are the drivers, and we're going to revisit these because these do represent the things that we want to use in determining what approach we take to driving the value of PLM. And so with that, let's drill into this some more, and we'll get into quite a bit of detail here and ideas of things that have we've used as an organization with a couple of hundred organizations and exercising this process, and it's driving successes. So we talked about an incremental approach, and I'm going to start with this back to this quadrant of the data cohesion and the process repeatability idea. And again, we're driving toward the top right quadrant, but the reality is it isn't a vector, right? We showed the line, the arrow there. It isn't a vector. In fact, we think it's represented by various steps, activities. So in other words, literally, you walk along the x-axis, so to speak, and you drive data improvement, data quality. Then you add the processes on top of that. And then you continue to do that. You do that for a next stage, and then you do it for a next stage. And ultimately, you're getting to where you want to be in terms of the data cohesion and the process repeatability. So this isn't new, but this is literally, we show the arrow in the x-axis first versus in the y-axis. So we believe it's about solidifying the data and the quality of the data as an initial step, and then to overlay that with the process repeatability, the processes that complement that specific data. So that's our strategy. That's our approach, the recommended approach that has worked and creates these opportunities for incremental wins and steps toward the so-called promise of PLM. So let's go back to this slide, this idea of the organization. So we've talked about these steps that the data step and then the process step. So what we recommend is let's take a look at the content, at the data that represents shared assets for the organization. It might be project data, especially if you're project intensive, where you're treating documents, say for example, and resources, etc. That might be shared by multiple activities in the organization. It could be bill of materials, right? The parts and the configurations that are associated with that, and it could be the drawings. So perhaps it's a very engineered to order. You're an engineered to order environment, and so the drawings and the documents represent the value of assets to different activities. So this is where we suggest starting, right? Take a look at what are the shared assets. And then we want to take it a step further. This is where we get into this, the 80-20, the Pareto principle, right? Is what can we do that drives 80% of the value and 20% of the effort, so to speak. It's a generalized, I'm not saying that that's the way it always works, of course, but it's a generalized theme, right? And so what we recommend is you start by looking at the value analysis of the data. So they're shared assets, and what do those assets represent? And again, we would encourage going back literally to the value associated at the P&L level. So the assets themselves, whatever those might be, as we just listed, and others, what is the value that those assets represent, meaning quality assets that are current, that are accurate, that are being managed. What do those represent? So we want to definitely stress that. We'll talk a little more about that. And then on top of that, here's the y-axis. This is characterize the associated processes. So you pick the data, the beachhead, so to speak, of what data we're going to work with, and then the process that we're going to put on top of that. Let me cite an example. This is based on experience, and experience has told us that for a majority of the manufacturers that we tend to work with, it tends to be the parts, the bills configurations that represent the so-called the important asset that serves these different activities in the organization. So we're gonna kind of springboard off of this. It could be others, but this is kind of some based on experience. It tends to be these parts. So along with this, then the process that becomes important to manage the so-called quality of that content is the change process. In fact, we tend to think that that really is the cornerstone of the whole bill of materials, the whole PLM environment is the change control process. And then finally, data is collected. We'll talk about that. The process is established, and then I want to stand that up on a unifying platform. Of course, that's what we suggest by PLM. That is the unifying platform. So let's go through a little more of a detailed checklist in terms of what this represents. 4 items, and we use the icon there, the data process repeatable icon to the right. But the checklist is we start with the data, as we've suggested. We're going to focus on part-oriented data versus just drawings versus just projects, as we suggested earlier. We then want to drill into the change management process itself, and we'll talk a little bit about some ideas and experiences that we could share with you that have been effective for that. We want to recognize that this can't live without integrations. I'm sure that some of you, if you've seen the earlier slides we talked about, the single source of truth, the reality is data is going to live in other places, so integrations are going to be important so that we can effectively create the single source paradigm of information. So we'll address that, and then some ideas around the implementation. So let's jump into a little more detail. From the data standpoint, here's some considerations that we want to put out. Nothing earth-shattering here, but things that tend to get repeated. And this first one is literally, where is the part number created? We've seen everything from literally notebooks, where engineering might grab a part number or a range of part numbers. Might be created in ERP, it might be created in other settings. But the theme here is, where are these part numbers created? Oftentimes there is a conversation about what kind of a part number should we create. And we tend not to have seen success with redoing the way a part number is created. We love the idea of a sequential non-significant part number, but making those kind of changes has numerous effects downstream, everything from what's already in your bill or your ERP to what your vendors order or work to, etc. So, but this is an important topic to visit and understand how this is done as it relates to data. The second part of this is, how much data should you start with? Is it, do we want to take all of that data that you have, or perhaps because you tend to be more engineer to order, build to order, that maybe the last couple years is sufficient. The history beyond that wouldn't necessarily be helpful. Of course, that varies in terms of what your organization is doing, but drilling into that and understanding where can you get the value with the data that you have, and then you balance this with the reality of what we would just call this data scrubbing, this cleaning the data. That is typically the critical path in an activity, and that's important. So balancing, what kind of data do I want, and then of course, how do I clean it and get it ready? Data is inaccurate, incomplete, there's duplicates, right? And there may also be an interest to amend and extend the metadata that exists for the parts that you have, and the bill and the configurations, etc. So this is an important part of that step. And then we follow that with the actual change management. Here's some ideas. The first is rethink the approach. We've seen organizations whose change management is multiple file folders in their organization, and the file folders represent stages, right? Work in process, review, and then released. And literally, someone, document control, or someone literally moves the files from one folder to another. And they think that represents their change management process, and they want to replicate it in the same perhaps nuances that go along with it. Well, this is an opportunity to rethink, because obviously if you're going to automate and create repeatable processes, those stages should be transparent and hidden behind activities. A little more detail there that we'll get into subsequent webinars, but incorporating best practice is a great opportunity, and configuration management is that practice, so to speak. A number of configuration management organizations and groups that do the training around that might be worth looking at. And then start with simple. We like simple. We like, these changes tend not to come easy. And adoption can take time. Things change. Adoption might be hampered. Adoption is critical to these things. So setting it up so that adoption is made is a key part of the consideration. And then include all participants in the change process. So in any of these processes, right? So we've seen on occasion somebody wants to be the ringleader, and maybe a handful of folks are involved in the process, and still others are connected through email and task assignments in that fashion. We don't recommend that. We recommend everybody get involved. Keep it simple, but keep everybody involved. And then on the application integration side, some considerations there as you're thinking about this. The CAD integrations we think are very important because they do tend to drive, especially if you're doing new design work, tend to drive the bill of materials. And so there's automated methods that allow your organization potentially to do the design work in CAD, and then as it's brought into PLM, the bills are automatically created and synchronized, linked to the CAD drawing itself. Software development environments are a little more challenging. Things are getting much more complex these days, right? Your organization may be doing some code work that are buried in some of the technology that and some of the products that you ship. We tend to see on the software development environments where you use and continue to use your source code management tools, but then on release, you release the source code executable potentially to your PLM environment and register it at that point. So the integration there is typically, people are doing it, but we tend to see still frankly, a manual process that's included. I've included Microsoft Office. It's a popular tool. Great number of mechanisms that allow for a nice integration with PLM so that if you're working on a proposal, then you activate a proposal template, you get the metadata that's associated with it, and so on. So we certainly encourage doing that if that becomes part of the data assets that you want to collect. And then ERP is, of course, where all of your item masters exist, and we think of it as a very transactional environment, but important, obviously. And so, automated integrations are great. However, they tend to be a number of things involved in that. So, for starters, we like to just continue to use a bulk import tool. Once something's released, the configuration's released, move it into a import method. And then next phase, consider the automation. We're not suggesting not do it, but again, in this crawl, walk, run approach, consider just doing an import. And then from an implementation side, it really is, in our experience, about being fleet-footed, getting things done efficiently, and we love the Agile method. We certainly encourage it. It's great, especially when things are pretty much in place. It may be manual, but things are understood, and now you want to automate it. So Agile approaches really make a lot of sense. Based on user stories and sprints, sprints can be anywhere from, typically 3 weeks in length, where you get some things done and go through the testing. But the value here is that you can create short wins, what we call short wins, success milestones, value delivered in weeks, not months. So we certainly encourage that kind of consideration when you look at, okay, how do we put all this together? So here are the takeaways that we want to share with you in this second webinar, and about how to create this beachhead, how to create the foothold to get started with pursuing a PLM vision for your organization. The first is start with, pick the right data. Simple term there, but we talked about identifying data that represents assets across the different activities, but is also tied to the business value. That's where we talk about this leverage the value analysis approach. And then for most organizations, the low-hanging fruit might be bill of materials and change management. That's what we just discussed, and we continue to see that again and again in engineering, manufacturing organizations. And then build on the small wins. This is where we like the Agile approach. Creating small wins. We're not boiling the ocean. We're creating effectivity in a short period of time. And all of this, third bullet here, all of this is really incremental, but driven, powered by, we like to think, powered by driving business value. So we can oftentimes get stuck in the nuances of doing this or that, but lose sight of what ultimately are we driving or adding value to the business for. And so we absolutely encourage that kind of approach. So there's our highlights in this short time, but hopefully informative. So with that, I will turn it back over to Jamie, and Jamie, if we have any questions here in the remaining few minutes, I'm more than happy to address those.
Great, terrific. Thank you, Martin. We've set aside the remainder of our time for Q&A. And let's take a look here at our questions. Our first question, Martin, what are your thoughts on not integrating with CAD right away?
So, yeah, that's a good question. You know, I can see situations where an organization might be using CAD for more two-dimensional work, more for the purpose of defining the requirements versus drawings that contain the bill of materials. If drawings contain, if during the course of doing the work with, say, you know, Inventor or SolidWorks or a number of, the 3D solutions that inherently capture the bill of materials, then having the integration creates efficiency because I can work directly with my PLM environment and check in and check out, and the bills are automatically created and synchronized. I could see in situations where it might be AEC building oriented where I have to do drawings, but those drawings don't have bill of materials or downstream value other than requirements, which is important, of course. So I could see that continuing to use CAD separately, and then as documents are completed, then you might check them into your PLM environment. But I would distinguish that decision by looking at the bills, the parts at least that might be in a drawing, and how they could be synchronized with the PLM. That being the consideration.
Good, great. We've got another question here. We currently use SharePoint. Can we use that as our PLM solution?
SharePoint is so prevalent, and that's a great question. SharePoint is, in our experience with SharePoint, we work with SharePoint, it's been a wonderful tool to manage documents and to support processes. When we think of PLM, as we just completed this conversation, we talked about the extensive, it's the common asset are parts and configurations, and we have not seen success in something like a SharePoint or a straight, you know, a document-oriented management solution. So we would, if you're pursuing PLM where you're managing parts, configurations, you got change process on top of that, really PLM has been designed to support that and is really optimized for treating that kind of environment.
Okay, Martin, we have time for one more question.
Okay.
You talk about short wins, but don't say how long. How long would you say?
Oh, in that previous slide, your build on short wins, small wins. Yeah, good question. You know, we have seen, you know, based on the agile approach, we have seen wins created, meaning that data gets converted, processes get stood up in a couple of months, and that might represent 3 sprints, so to speak. So if we're in the spirit of agile, we're using sprints, and in a matter of 3 weeks for each sprint, one might be in that 9-week area. But yeah, I'd say 2 to 3 months for standing up, you know, that incremental, that XY step that we shared earlier is probably a 2 to 3 month period.
Great. Thank you, Martin. Thank you for your thoughts and insights. And I'd like to thank all of you for attending and making time in your busy schedules. Once again, a recording of this webinar will be made available to you within the next 48 hours. This concludes today's webinar. And thank you again.
Thank you.